25 men are lying flat in the dark, guns loaded, staring at a dirt road. It's July 10th, 1919, East Texas, hot as hell even at 1 in the morning. And these men, all of them black, all of them armed, are guarding a house that belongs to a school teacher named Samuel Jones, because word has gotten out that a white mob is coming to burn it down, maybe worse than burn it. They don't have to wait long. Headlights swing around the corner. A dozen or so white men roll up, some carrying guns of their own, thinking this is going to be easy, thinking nobody's home, thinking nobody would actually fight back. They were wrong. Gunfire rips through the night. Men on both sides go down, and within an hour, word spreads through the town like wildfire. Black men in Longview shot back. And that single fact is about to turn a quiet cotton town of 5,700 people into a war zone, bring in the Texas Rangers and the National Guard, and become one of the most buried stories in American history. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly why this almost never got told. And there's a detail near the end about a marker outside a courthouse that's going to make you rethink how a whole town decided to forget. All right, if you're new here, welcome. This channel digs into the forgotten and flat-out buried chapters of American history, especially the ones involving racial violence that never made it into your textbook. If that's your kind of thing, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got a lot more of these coming. And seriously, watch the whole thing. There are details in the back half of this video, and even a couple in the middle, that most people, even folks who grew up in East Texas, have genuinely never heard. I'm trying to build something real here, a community of people who actually want this history told right, not sanitized. So drop a comment when you're done watching. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the best leads for future videos come straight from y'all. All right, let's get into it. So here's the thing you need to understand about Longview in 1919. This wasn't some big city. It was a small cotton and lumber town in Gregg County, northeast Texas, about 125 miles east of Dallas. Population, 5,700. Roughly a third of them were black. Zoom out to the whole county, it's closer to half. 16,700 people, 48% of them black. This is deep cotton country, the kind of land that depended on enslaved labor before the Civil War and never fully let go of the economics that came with it. And by 1919, something's shifting under the surface. World War I just ended. Thousands of black soldiers came home from fighting in Europe, where, by the way, a lot of them experienced something they'd never had at home. French civilians treating them like actual human beings. No segregated seating, no stepping off the sidewalk. They came back to the United States expecting something different, better jobs, basic respect, a sliver of the dignity they'd just risked their lives overseas to earn. That expectation collided head-on with a country that had zero intention of giving it to them. And 1919 became what historians now call Red Summer, a stretch from May to October where at least 25 separate race riots erupted across the United States. Chicago, Washington, D.C., Omaha, Nebraska, Elaine, Arkansas, and Longview, Texas was the second one on that grim list. Here's a number that puts it in perspective, and it's one almost nobody brings up. In 1919 alone, 78 black Americans were lynched in the state of Texas. That's 15 more than the year before, and 30 more than 1917. Lynching wasn't some rare horror by this point. In East Texas, it was practically seasonal. And here's the local detail almost nobody talks about, the thing that turned general resentment into a specific, targeted fuse. It wasn't just abstract racial tension. There was an actual economic trigger sitting right in the middle of town. Two of the most respected black men in Longview, a school teacher named Samuel Jones, and a 34-year-old physician named Dr. Calvin P. Davis had been encouraging local black cotton farmers to stop selling their crop to the white cotton brokers in town. Instead, sell directly to buyers down in Galveston and cut out the middleman entirely. Black residents had even gone a step further and opened their own cooperative store. Think about what that actually meant in 1919 Texas. It meant black economic independence, organized and visible, right in the middle of a town built on the old order. And to a lot of white businessmen there, that wasn't progress. That was a threat to be dealt with. So you've already got resentment simmering under the surface of this town before a single shot is fired. Then, in early June, it gets lit.
A local black man named Lemuel Walters gets accused of making advances toward a white woman from the nearby town of Kilgore. Some accounts say he was found in her bedroom. Whatever actually happened between them, under Jim Crow law, that accusation alone was functionally a death sentence, no trial required. Two white men, purportedly her brothers, track Walters down and whip him. He's arrested and locked up in the Gregg County Jail. Supposedly, that's where the story ends. He's in custody. He's safe. He wasn't. On the night of June 17th, a lynch mob of about 10 men shows up at that jail. And here's the detail that should make your blood boil. The sheriff handed him over. Just handed him straight to the mob, no resistance. They took Walters out, shot him to death, and left his body dumped near the railroad tracks like garbage. Dr. Davis, Samuel Jones, and a small group of other respected black men in town did something that took real serious courage in 1919 East Texas. They went straight to a local judge, a man named Bramlett, and asked him to formally investigate the lynching. The judge's response? He asked Jones for the names of everyone Jones had talked to inside that jail, not the names of the killers, the names of the witnesses who talked to a black reporter. When no investigation ever materialized, the men went back to Bramlett a second time, and that's when they realized this man had zero intention of doing anything at all. The case was dead on arrival. So Samuel Jones, who, remember, is not just a school teacher, he's also the local correspondent for the Chicago Defender, one of the biggest and most influential black newspapers in the entire country, does the one thing he still has power to do. He writes it down. And on July 5, 1919, the Chicago Defender publishes the story of Lemuel Walters' lynching for a national black audience, from Chicago to Harlem to towns just like Longview all over the South. Now here's your first open loop, and I want you to actually sit with this for a second. The article didn't just report the killing in flat, neutral terms. It reported that Walters and this white woman had genuinely been in love, that, according to her own words, if the two of them had lived anywhere in the North, they would have married. Whether every detail of that was exactly accurate, we may never fully know. The white press at the time told a completely different story, painting Walters as a burglar who threatened a married woman. But that Chicago Defender version, the love story version, is the one that traveled, and it's the detail that's about to get Samuel Jones nearly beaten to death. Hang on to that, because it comes all the way back around before this video is over. 5 days after that article runs, on July 10th, a mob forms in downtown Longview. They find Jones near the courthouse and they beat him, purportedly the very brothers of the woman named indirectly in that article. Jones survives, but he's badly hurt. He manages to get away and finds his friend, Dr. Davis. And Davis doesn't waste a single second. He starts organizing a defense because word is already spreading through both communities, white and black, that this isn't over, not even close. That night, Jones goes into hiding at a relative's house on the edge of town. Meanwhile, Davis and roughly 25 armed black men take up defensive positions at his own home, convinced a mob is coming back to finish what it started at the courthouse. Around 1 a.m., they were right. A dozen or so armed white men show up at the house. This is the exact scene we opened the video with, except now you know the full context behind it. This isn't random violence. This is retaliation stacked on retaliation. A newspaper article on top of months of resentment over black economic independence, on top of a lynching the courts refuse to even look at. Gunfire breaks out. Several of the white attackers are shot, one badly beaten. The mob that came expecting an easy night retreats, but not for good. They go get reinforcements, a lot of reinforcements. Here's where the scale of this thing becomes almost impossible to picture. The dozen men who showed up at 1 a.m. come back later that same night, except now there are close to 1,000 of them. Think about that number for a second. 1,000 people in a town of 5,700. That's a full third of the town's entire white population, mobilized, armed, and furious that black men had actually dared to shoot back. They burn Jones's house to the ground. They don't stop there. Homes and businesses across the black side of town go up in flames over the following 2 days. A grocery store, family homes, properties belonging to some of the most respected members of the black community are systematically targeted and destroyed. And in the chaos, Dr. Davis's own father-in-law, a man named Marion Bush, gets chased down through the streets and killed. Local officials, who had ignored every single warning sign leading up to this point, finally panic and call the governor. Texas Governor William Hobby sends in the Texas Rangers and the Texas National Guard. Martial law gets declared. A curfew goes into effect. Nobody's allowed to gather in groups larger than 3, and every single resident of Longview, black and white alike, is ordered to hand over their personal firearms and pile them up on the courthouse lawn, guarded by soldiers in uniform. There's an actual photograph of this, a literal pile of confiscated guns and ammunition on the lawn of the same courthouse where Samuel Jones had been beaten just days earlier. 21 black men get arrested, 9 white men get arrested. And here's a number that tells you everything about how justice actually functioned in 1919 East Texas. Of those 30 arrests, not one single person is ever put on trial. Not one. Local historians later suggested Gregg County officials deliberately avoided trials, specifically to cool tensions down, likely knowing full well that any all-white jury would acquit the white defendants without a second thought, and might just as easily convict the black men who'd only been defending their own homes. So instead, everybody just quietly walked. The 21 black men who'd been arrested were actually taken out of town by the National Guard for their own protection and scattered into jails in other counties at Gregg County's own expense until things calmed down enough for them to be released. Samuel Jones and Dr. Davis never came back to Longview, ever. They fled, first to Austin for safety, and eventually all the way north to Chicago, where they had to rebuild entire lives and careers from scratch. In August of 1919, the two of them sat down for an extended interview with the NAACP's national office, including its white executive secretary, John Shillity, and a local black dentist named Charles Bentley. Their first-hand account of what actually happened in Longview ended up published in The Crisis, the NAACP's national magazine, that October, which, honestly, is one of the only reasons we have as much detail about this event as we do today. Without that interview, this might have vanished entirely. Martial law in Longview wasn't lifted until noon on July 18th, a full week after it started. Town officials then made a public push to promote harmonious relations between the races, which, if you know anything about how these things typically played out, is a phrase that did almost nothing to actually change conditions on the ground for the black residents who stayed behind. Here's your second open loop, and it's one that widens the whole picture. Longview wasn't an isolated freak event. It was the second riot of Red Summer, and it absolutely was not the last. Weeks later, Chicago exploded into a week of violence that left 38 people dead and more than 500 injured, with entire neighborhoods burned. That fall, Omaha, Nebraska had its own riot. By the time Red Summer finally burned itself out in October, cities across the entire country, Washington, Baltimore, New Orleans, Little Rock, Houston, had all gone through some version of exactly what Longview went through. So why does Longview specifically matter out of 25 different riots that year? Because of what it reveals about the mechanism. This wasn't spontaneous chaos, it was a predictable chain reaction. Economic resentment, plus a lynching nobody would investigate, plus a black journalist who refused to stay silent, plus armed black self-defense that the white community found unthinkable. Every single one of those ingredients was already sitting in towns just like Longview all across the South in 1919. Longview just happened to be where the match got struck first in Texas.
So here's your third and final open loop, and this is the one that's going to bring us all the way back around to that opening detail about Lemuel Walters. For over 100 years, there was no marker, no plaque, nothing in Longview publicly acknowledging any of this ever happened. A town of over 80,000 people today, and for a full century, the deadliest week in its own history was basically erased from the physical landscape. Locals I've read accounts of could point out exactly where a house burned down. That's where Professor Jones's place was. That's where the Quick Haul grocery store stood. But there was nothing official, nothing you could point a stranger toward. That changed just a few years ago when a Texas state historical marker recognizing the 1919 riot was finally placed outside the Gregg County Courthouse, the same courthouse where Samuel Jones was beaten, the same courthouse lawn where residents were forced to pile up their guns under armed guard a century earlier. A century later, in the exact same spot. And now, remember that detail I asked you to hold on to way back in Part 2? The Chicago defenders claimed that Lemuel Walters and that white woman from Kilgore were genuinely in love, that they'd talked about marriage if only the laws had been different. That single sentence in a newspaper is arguably the reason this entire chain of events happened at all. Not the lynching by itself, not the economic tension by itself. It was the public acknowledgement, in print, for a national black readership that a black man and a white woman in Texas had loved each other as equals. That was the detail that was unforgivable to the people running that town, not the killing itself, the love. That's Longview, 1919. A single article written by a small-town schoolteacher who refused to let a lynching disappear quietly, cracked open decades of buried economic and racial tension, and forced the entire state of Texas to send in its Rangers and its National Guard to occupy a town of fewer than 6,000 people. And it stayed buried for 100 years until a plaque finally went up outside the same courthouse where it all started. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the stuff that actually shaped this country but somehow never made it into a single textbook you were ever handed in school, subscribe and drop a comment telling me which event you want covered next. I read every one of them, I mean that. See you in the next video.